Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. If I may have your kind attention. Welcome. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. I'm truly honored to be hosting today's book talk, Defiant Dreams, the journey of an Afghan girl who risked everything for education. And I feel very lucky to have both Sola Mahfouz and Malaina Kapoor with us here to talk about the book, to talk about the journey of the book. So welcome, and thank you so much. Thank you for your courage, but thank you for writing this book. And I'm going to start with you, Sola. Before we tell the audience what you're up to today, I would love for all of you to pick up the book, and we will have them outside. Tell us a little bit more about your journey, telling your story to Malaina and basically putting all of this together. I mean, this is basically reliving your stories through the book. You have shown courage, persistence, and so much hard work, and you let your dreams guide you. So what does that feel like?
Thanks for having us, and thanks everyone for joining. When I was 11 years old, I was forced to stop going to school. A group of men came to our door and threatened me if I continued. And from that day on, the restriction on my life continued to increase. I left home only a couple of times a year, and whenever I did, I had to wear this suffocating burqa that covered me from head to toe. And meanwhile, my brothers were going to school and they're thriving academically. And I was really jealous of their life and who were they becoming. And I found that, through education, I can be like that. And, this book tells the story of, how at age 14, I start, teaching myself English. At the time when I would listen for hours to BBC or CNN and just understand a word or two. And then at age 16, because I left school so early and I forgot everything that I once knew, I did not even know how to add and subtract. And went to in 3 years, because learning became an obsession for me. That was the only thing that I had control over my life. And I went on to taking calculus and physics, and I wanted to become a physicist because I really wanted to understand the world, and the social world was so complex, but the physical world there was a way to understand, and that's how, eventually I took the SAT, and after many, many obstacles, I was able to come to the US. And I wanted to tell this story because Afghanistan is mostly seen through journalistic views and extreme situations, which I think strips the humanity of the people, and it blocks the way from people to empathize. And so this story is about my story, but it also, reflects on the experience of Afghans in general, and because it's personal, it creates a space for people to feel and care, and hopefully that eventually will lead to a change.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I think from my perspective, in the United States, I think we often have this fragmented understanding of what Afghanistan is, right? We understand it maybe in the context of the Cold War, in the context of 2001, and then maybe in terms of current events. But what we often lack is that more full understanding of the country colored by the individual experiences of people who live there. And so that was my goal in joining Sola on this project, was to help tell those kinds of stories, which have become so much more relevant today. There's so much of the book that's deeply personal to Sola's unique experience, but there's so much that now speaks to the experience of women and girls in Afghanistan today. The fact that, one story that comes to mind for me from the book is the story of when Sola had to stop going to school, and she was only 11 at that time. And that's an age that's so young that you can't really comprehend the immensity of what's happening to you. But as we write about in the book, her mother had been a student at Kabul University and then a professor at Kabul University, and then she had to watch as her own daughter couldn't even complete an elementary school education. And so our goal really with this book was to take something that's intensely personal and broaden it to hopefully send a message that applies to many more.
And thank you so much for telling your story and sharing that story. There's a lot of challenge and pain, and you were really able to capture all of it. I felt that I was smelling the spices and the food and the cooking, but also felt the pain of everything else that you had witnessed as a child, but also when you came back here and witnessed what is happening in Afghanistan. One thing I was so struck by is how determined you were to go online. Everybody else wanted jewelry at your age, and you asked your mom for a laptop, and through that learned how to use the internet. And then, thanks to the Khan Academy, headquartered out of California, you were able to do all these classes, and then basically started doing calculus. And to those of you who have not yet read the book, what Sola is up to in Boston is basically a quantum computing researcher at Tufts University's Quantum Information Group. So it's really fascinating, the journey that you took. So what is it that really kept you going throughout all of this?
So I had a grandfather who was self-taught, and he said, like, English and education in general, it's a window to the world. And it helps you understand who you are today and who you want to become tomorrow. And I think for me, that spoke to me really personally. And the thing was, again, the world was in a turmoil, the suicide bomber exploding, and every small thing I had to be dependent on my father, on my brothers, and education is also, I felt, because Afghanistan in general, it's kind of this understanding, women are stupid, and that's why they are in situations like that. And so when I started learning, I was initially kind of surprised, like, oh, I'm able to learn. And I think that itself for me was, I think that's just like, I was continuously proving what was kind of tacitly agreed wrong. And I think I had like so many questions, and I think I just wanted to understand that, and I think that's what I think that's what kept me going.
And that's really amazing, given all the different challenges that you faced, but also the society that you lived in, and how, as you mentioned, girls and women are constantly kept in the private sphere, away from everything. And then the contrast of that when you came here. But Malaina, before we go further, I wanted to ask you how you guys met, and how did this book journey happen in the first place?
Sure. So we were introduced during COVID, actually. So for the first year almost, we weren't able to meet in person, but instead Sola started telling me stories from her life, and I started writing them down. And I think, as you mentioned, just in summarizing the book, the first thing that drew me to this project was just how incredible this story is. The fact that someone was forced to stop going to school, at the idea that at age 16 you would know how to add or subtract, but the fact that she was able to somehow find a website online, Khan Academy, to teach her connect using this extremely slow dial-up internet connection. She had to study in the middle of the night because that was the only time as a woman in her household she wasn't required to cook and clean. And from that, she was able to make it to the United States, and not just make it, but really achieve so much, just looking academically, and as well personally so much. That was really the story that drew me. But I also, I came to the project with a very strong interest in women's rights, but there are things you can read in a book or a newspaper that I think hit so much more differently when you hear them, when you hear a personal account of them. And that's what really kept me going throughout this process. One example is, I knew that arranged marriage is common for girls in Afghanistan, but that's different from then hearing what it's like growing up in Sola's hometown of Kandahar, where girls are expected to be married by age 16. And what does that mean when you're a 16-year-old girl who's finding out about yourself and who you are and finding education, but also coming up against that roadblock that all girls face there? Or, you know, I knew what a burqa is, and I knew it's the most restrictive covering, you know, that women in the world wear, but I had never spoken to someone who had gone through that experience. And there's one story in the book about the first time Sola's younger brother saw his mother wear a burqa after the Civil War. And he was just a kid, and he actually thought that she had gone blind. And it was just this little boy, you know, taking his mother, showing her where the street ended, because he thought, you know, she couldn't see. And of course, there are those crisscross slats, so you can see some things through the burqa, and people, you know, his family was laughing at him, but I think that was an innocent assessment that was generally correct in a lot of ways, right? When you lose so much when you wear that, and I think those are the kinds of things that really motivated both of us through this book and wanting to share them.
One thing that struck me, I think, in the very first chapters, you were talking about your cousins and some other, like, you know, girls in education, and then at some point you said the girls were the hungriest for opportunities. And I'm from the Middle East, and I see the same thing, and I'm constantly surprised by it. Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's like every time you're told that you can't, like, you know, the men, like, okay, they can go play, no matter how, no matter, even like the time of the Taliban, first time, people still, like, the boys can still do karate and all of that. It just, the women are just like, okay, you're confined to these four walls of your home. Yeah. And not only that, then you're told, you know, you know, you lose your self-confidence and everything in that. And I think even just like the small opportunity you get,
you take it.
Yeah, you take it and you want to make something out of it.
And what did you learn about sort of this, you know, fire in the belly that all these girls and young women have, not just in Afghanistan, but like in general?
Sure. I think, to Sola's point, it's just that there are so many more obstacles that young people in Afghanistan faced at the time that Sola was growing up and continued to face now. And then when you add the restrictions of being a woman, being a young girl, you know, everyone does have that intrinsic drive, but when it's constantly repressed, I can imagine at least that those few opportunities become so much more valuable. And, you know, just thinking again about some of the stories from the book, just how difficult it was, for example, for Sola to prove her education and apply to programs outside Afghanistan as compared to her brother, who, you know, faced difficulties, but he was able to prove his high school certification. He was able to go by himself and take an English proficiency test, and that's what eventually got him out of the country. But for Sola, because she was secretly educating herself, first of all, there was no way to prove that she was at a high school level. So she tried to go to the Ministry of Education in Kandahar, but they wouldn't even look her in the eyes because she was a woman, right? Let alone give her the proper certification. Then she tried to take the GED, which she would have had to have a man take her to, but that test wasn't even offered in Afghanistan or any neighboring countries. And so the SAT became her last chance at a way out. But even that exam wasn't offered in Afghanistan, so she had to cross one of the world's most dangerous borders, a border where it's common for people to be beaten with electric cables, where men and women are separated, where you have to take multiple cars. She made it to Karachi. She took the last slot in the test administration there. And that was all that she had to go through, you know, before she even turned in an application somewhere. So I think it's just those kinds of restrictions that have to spur you on.
Yeah, that keep you going. And I want to turn to what you've learned so far, Sola, about basically online education. That was your ticket to come here to America. That was what guaranteed you, you know, your educated self, right? And so how can the United States in particular at this time, and maybe the international community, invest more in such, you know, online education platforms to ensure that the generation that is left behind in Afghanistan today is not yet another lost generation?
Yeah, I think we need to be more creative with our solutions. And so I think, as we already know, it's so hard for a woman to be educated and almost impossible to get out. And sometimes U.S. gets on the way. And so recently I heard a story of a woman, she got a Fulbright scholarship, but the U.S. didn't give her a visa. And it's my story too, I walked around the problem. Okay, I self-educated myself online, and then I had to take the SAT, and then I applied for schools. I got accepted to some, and then I went to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and in 1 minute, I will not forget what the officer told me, that you're not going there to study. And what he saw was this young person and desperate, wanted to get out, but he didn't saw what I went through to be able to come to this point. So I think, the U.S. first needs to shatter this narrow view that they see the Afghans through, and then, and make it easier, and give also, I think, if the girls in Afghanistan, for example, know that there's an outside world, that they care, and say you get educated, things, there will be a way to get out. I think it's going to give hope to more girls to continue, and also give an incentive that the family will also they will have an incentive. Okay, I'm going to invest in this daughter, and eventually she will be able to she will become something, and I think that will kind of, it's not going to fully solve the problem.
Sure.
But it will somehow band-aid it.
It will help.
Yeah, and Marissa, to your point about online education, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I'm a student at Stanford now, and what we've talked a lot about is that idea of, okay, if the situation is that people are secretly educating themselves or educating themselves in conflict zones in Afghanistan, but also in other countries. How do we provide a way for them to prove their knowledge, to certify their knowledge, that doesn't require crossing borders to take a test that is already difficult to take outside the United States, or doesn't require you to be driven somewhere by a male relative or someone to actually fill out bubbles? What do those solutions look like, and how can we integrate? How can we look at educational technology as another front that goes beyond building physical schools or actually getting people on the ground, but still provides those opportunities and pathways for people to get out?
And it's so important because beyond education, but also because of education, we've seen young girls and women in Iran this past year basically mobilize, organize, and if they didn't have that window, they wouldn't have also been able to basically lead this movement. And things may have, closed down a little bit, but it was really online access that gave them that courage, but the access to information, to knowledge. And that kind of brings me back to where we are today, because this month we will be commemorating the second anniversary of the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan and a very swift takeover by the Taliban. And since then, they have been adamant at constantly restricting the space for women and girls in particular. We've seen various attacks on universities, but despite all of that, or in spite of that, we've also seen defiant women protesting. I will never forget the images I saw of Afghan university students protesting in front of the Iranian embassy in support of their Iranian friends and colleagues and maybe family, basically, since with all of the events happening in Iran. So how do these women have the courage? They're still taking risks to do that. Tell us a little bit more about how you see things.
I think it's at least I see it as that, the human spirit is to resist. And it's just it's like the problems are pressing against you, and you want to push it. And also when you lose everything, there's time comes you feel like you have nothing to lose to.
Yeah. And so you risk your life.
You push back and risk your life, and I think that's important for the outside world, not to just sit passively by and say, well, okay, this has happened, and so I think they really have to. So if these people who are in those situations are not giving up, why should we give up?
Thank you for that. And Malaina, I know you wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, particularly about the recent closures of beauty salons and how that symbolized more than just, like removing that whole aspect from women's lives. So,
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important to first understand what beauty salons meant in Afghanistan before they were forbidden. It was one of the last places that women were able to gather. It was a place that women could make their own money if there was no one else in the family who could work, or if they needed to, given the economic situation. I think it's estimated that around 60,000 women now have no way to provide for their families since the closures. And on a more philosophical level, Afghan women have had their education stripped from them, their jobs, their identities in these schools and workplaces. And so even something that can seem insignificant, like the way you look, I think becomes one of the final markers of your individualism. And so when even that is taken away, it's more than something economic, or it's a real mark on who you are as a person. And instead, these women are now forced to leave the home in these all-encompassing burqas. They are not given a place to be an individual person. And so I think that's really the broader issue behind the salon ban.
well, one thing that struck me is that salons are also where women get together. So there's a sense of community there beyond just family and friends that live nearby. And so yet, another obstacle is mounted to sort of curb any attempt for them to get together. And I see this in so many parts of the Middle East as well. We've seen, for example, an uptick in child marriage amongst Syrian refugee communities in Jordan and Lebanon and in Turkey, and this sort of obsession with just handing young daughters over as if they were merchandise. And I know that in the book there was this description of all these suitors coming in and how you had to, go upstairs and, get dressed and then go downstairs and just smile, but then your mom said don't smile. And there's all these like minuscule messages that would really completely destroy a soul. And I wonder, your story is inspiring. You pushed the envelope, but how many more girls and women are able to do the same?
I think again it's kind of it's hard because when there's no other opportunity, it's also, as the situation politically, as you said, like in Syria, the refugees. So there's a safety issue. If you're you have like, if you have unmarried daughter, you have this responsibility to take her. She should. You have to bring her to safety, and that safety is marriage.
Yeah.
And there's no education. You don't see anything in her future. So, 16 is the right age to get married. And I think, again, it's for women, I think even at times I gave up on things. I was like close to give up because there's so many hurdles on each step, and you want to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's kind of hard. And again, I think it comes to the people who are outside, how seriously and urgently they take this issue, and create a pathway. So.
Yeah, at the same time, I think one of our goals with this book was to push back against that narrative that's often placed on Afghan women of passivity, right? Like passive victims, nameless victims. And through the story, we've tried to show, Sola's act of rebellion was a rebellion of education. And that rebellion luckily led to a way out. But there are thousands of small rebellions that happen every day, rebellions against husbands who control all the finances, or in the kitchen, or with children. But those, because of the systematic injustices, those rebellions might buy a minute or a few days of freedom, but they ultimately aren't enough to liberate an entire gender.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about what the international community can do in terms of creating or being creative in solutions. But if you were to be sitting with, let's say representatives of 5 to 10 leading international NGOs right now, what would you tell them to prioritize?
So I think political engagement is one thing, but I think there needs to be engagement with more university to give scholarship, and there needs to be a system placed so that once a university gives you a scholarship, there needs to be a guaranteed or some form of visa, and they don't have to be just in the US. They should be, they can be in other countries like Turkey and all of these other places where it's not so expensive to give a full 4-year scholarship, and it's not hard to get a visa. So I think that's, or also there's a school, you might have been familiar with this boarding school, and now in Rwanda, Sola, it's a boarding school, and I think creating more opportunities like that, and then those girls, because they have experience, then they can be the leaders of tomorrow.
I think it also comes down to that issue of awareness, and this is something that applies to the media, but I think it also applies to political and NGO circles as well. When the Taliban took over for the second time in 2021, there was really this murkiness around what was going on. There was so much discussion of a Taliban 2.0, a new Taliban that is going to guarantee at least basic rights for women, that is interested maybe in sustaining an economy, that wants to be a part of the international community. And that was the story that stayed about the Taliban for as long as Afghanistan was, in that news cycle. And it was only after a few months had passed that then you saw this systematic rolling back of core freedoms, where it got to a point that women were losing liberties almost every few weeks, all the way, coming up to last week when the beauty salons were banned. And so, it's really about, how do we share that?
Yeah, and as you said, awareness is important, not just in the media, because the media also has a very short attention span. And so it's keeping the conversation going. It's telling human stories, telling your story to others. I was really struck by your relationship with your nephew Hamid, and how he was inspired by what you did, and how you guided him through taking courses with the Khan Academy. So I'd like you to just talk a little bit about that, how basically you, an Afghan woman who fought for education, became the role model of a young Afghan boy.
Yeah, so I think what I observed was also, I felt like there's a lot of problems that exist because of patriarchy. And I wanted my nephew to not see the world that the Afghan man in general saw it. So that was and I also, because what I got from my grandfather, I want to instill that love of learning for him. And again, he was even in more Afghanistan when he was growing up, it was even more there was constant talk of Taliban takeover. Yeah. And I kind of said, well, okay, whatever happens, as long as you can hold pen and book, you're going to be fine. So now he's actually in Canada, and
wonderful.
Yeah, and it's so great to see, because he's kind of taking part, he takes parts in debates, and talks about the good and the bad of artificial intelligence.
Oh wow!
So
we will invite him next to the Wilson Center, that's for sure. As we explore the impact of artificial intelligence on the work that we do.
And I think it also kind of gave me hope, things can change. It's not just
black or white.
Yeah, it's not set.
Yeah, absolutely. What were some of the anecdotes, and there's so many, Malaina, that were very dear to you as you co-authored this book?
Sure. I think there was a lot in Sola's story that I could relate to, not obviously in terms of the restrictions she faced growing up in Afghanistan, but in terms of her relationship to family or her culture. You know, Kandahar, where she grew up, is so close to Pakistan, which used to be a part of India. And so there are just so many moving stories in the book that talk about the generational experience in Afghanistan, you know, starting with one of her grandmothers who basically secretly educated her children by lying to her husband. Her husband said you can only educate them till the 5th grade, and somehow for 10 years none of those children ever, you know, passed the 5th grade, and he somehow didn't investigate any further than that. So growing up with a grandmother like that, who then had to watch, you know, rights be rolled back, growing up with a mother who was raised to always believe by her father, you know, in the intrinsic value that women have, in the, you know, how far they can go. She had aunts who had, you know, received scholarships to study abroad. Her mother had been a student at Kabul University, and then, you know, her own relationship with sisters who, just by chance of being born a few years earlier, you know, had radically different lives than she did, had to get married, you know, had to live, never had a chance to learn online or anything like that. And so I think there's so many beautiful scenes of the family together, but they're also, I think, very poignant because it speaks to just how many generations of tragedy have unfolded in Afghanistan.
And that takes me to sort of what we're seeing unfold across also the Middle East and North Africa region. I know Afghanistan was always lumped together with MENA and kind of reframed the greater Middle East. But where we are today, and, you know, as we work on various initiatives here at the Middle East program, we're constantly looking at, you know, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and then how this is impacting neighboring countries with the flow of refugees, and most recently Sudan. We just published a piece today on basically what it's like after 4 months of fighting in Sudan, and how the civilians are the ones that are trapped. It impacts people, and then in the case of Afghanistan, it's sort of constantly back and forth into the future and the past, right? And where we are today, you know, as we near this anniversary, is perhaps an opportunity to just raise that message. So what is that one message that you would like to amplify?
So I think, you know, because I'm continuously learning about Afghanistan, is that, you know, before the civil war, the Russians were there, the US was invested in it. And then once the Russian pulled out, the US was like, okay, we're done with Afghanistan. And then the 2001 happened, then I think the focus was back to Afghanistan. In all of those gaps, this was a gap of an understanding. And then again now, 2021, I think again, there's not as much engagement. And again, even that engagement when it happens, it's with the very people who are part of the problem. For example, like, you know, those corrupt officials that in Afghanistan didn't fall just because the Taliban took over. The government inside was crumbling.
Yeah.
And so I think there needs to be like a continuous, you know, intellectual engagement, and also with people who represent Afghans who genuinely care. And there needs to be, even if the US is there or not there, I think Afghanistan is important for the world, and it needs to be taken as that.
And what about the Afghan diaspora? There are lots of people who have left at various junctures in Afghanistan's modern history. Is there any organizing at the, you know, diaspora level, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere, to basically be part of that engagement?
Yeah, I think one of the great things that did come out of those 20 years, I think it created a generation of educated Afghans who had understanding of their own country and also of the West. And I think this kind of builds the bridge. So I think that will, if there's a coherent system I think those people will be very valuable to that.
Malaina, care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think to a previous comment, that idea, and what you're saying too, Sola, is that we have this piecemeal understanding of Afghanistan. I think I definitely came to this project with understanding of certain time periods, basically as Afghanistan relates to the United States, and it was a real education to then open the door to that fuller picture. And I think to your point about the generations too, it's easy to speak about millions or thousands of people, a generation of Afghans who grew up under the U.S., the generation who won't. But I think the beauty in the stories in this book is that you can really see the conversations that Sola and her siblings and her cousins are having as they, come of age and start to understand their place in the world, the place of Afghanistan, beyond just the Middle East, but England and your other places in Europe, in the United States, and understand the kind of hunger that inspired in them. I mean, all her male siblings through education got out of the country. She's the only sister, but there was definitely something in that family that's, I think, reflected in the book that does speak to a broader characteristic of that generation.
So before we head to comments and questions from our in-person audience as well as our online audience, this is a live webcast, as you know. There's this quote that towards the end, when you had just called your mom to tell her about your new job opportunity in Boston, that I'm gonna remember every day as a mom of two rebellious toddlers. Everything that got you into trouble in Afghanistan has now led you to success in America. And I love that. So congratulations to you, but also to your family for being there for you at various junctures. And yes, there were challenges, but thank you again for sharing this story. I do want to give an opportunity to all of you to comment or ask questions, and I'm going to start with my mentor, Hala Isfandiari, who's the founder of the Middle East program.
Thank you. I'm Hala Isfandiari, part of the Middle East program. I thought your book was...
Sorry, can we try this one?
I have a loud voice. It was riveting, really. I was telling my colleague, Mr. Naderi, who is from Afghanistan, I said, you have to read the book. I was very much impressed with your mother, really, because for her time, she was an impressive woman. She was a university professor. And I felt that deep down, she believed that her children have to leave Afghanistan. This is not a place for them to stay. Of course, the boys took priority, but deep down, she wanted you to leave too. But what I couldn't understand was her insistence of you going to the Quran school. Why, as a former university professor, she didn't teach you and your sisters at home during the Taliban. That was a bit, puzzling for me. That's one thing. And I have a question for you. As Sola was telling you, what happened to her life story, what did go through your mind when she said when she was 7, this and this happened, 9, and so on, 10, and so on? Did you try and compare your own life with her while this was going? Because when I was reading the book, I kept on thinking of young Iranian women who, had all the possibilities, and which is interesting, a number of the Afghani women who crossed the borders, families who lived in Iran, when you would press them, they would say, we want our daughters to be educated. And in the camps, there were schools for the girls. That's
So I think maybe there's a story didn't get into the book, but actually my mom did when the Taliban were in power. My mom did teach us like the basic, how to write our names, how to read the basic alphabet, and all of that. And when we went to school, like a lot of the kids did not know how to hold a pen, and we were able to hold a pen, and we know the ABC and all of that, and also, that, but also I think you also have to be, if you live in that culture, you can't just rebel against everything. You have to become part of you have to obey some of those rules. And I think my mom was keeping that balance.
Yeah, I think to that point, there's that idea of fear and how fear always colors so many decisions, and maybe that was part of the reason that she wanted you to take those lessons. I think it was, if there's so many chapters in the book where you can see her wrestling with her own childhood, where she had been educated in the ideals that she had built at that time, and then the experiences she had had after that, which I think likely shattered so much of what she'd had as a younger woman. And I think Sola and I first met in 2020, and so we were very close friends and co-authors, of course, during the time of the Taliban takeover. And I was talking with her at many times when she was trying to talk to her nephew and other family members at that juncture. And I think you experienced something very similar, right? Where at one level you want your nephew or your niece to be as educated and as free as they can be, and you have the tools to give them that. But also, if they're going to be trapped within a society where none of that is acceptable, and in fact it's dangerous, then there's also this overwhelming fear that grips you, and you're kind of working with two competing impulses. And I can't imagine what that's like, but of course it must be so difficult. And to your other question, in terms of thinking about Sola saying at 11 I had to stop going to school versus what I was like at 11, I think of course you can't help compare. I think anybody, especially people who grew up in the United States, who reads it can't help but compare. And for me especially, at the time that I started writing the book, I was at a juncture in my own life. I was about to start college at Stanford, and it's such a sad experience, I think, to witness your own life opening up as you're hearing about someone's life as it started to close in. And so, yeah, of course, it was so powerful.
Thank you. Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. I spent a year in Afghanistan, and so I want to thank you very much for your courage to write this book, both of you, and to share your story. And I think more Americans need to hear it. You talk about Afghans as sort of, and it gives the impression of sort of one group. And of course, there is a country of Afghanistan and people who live in it who are called Afghans. But I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about whether, in your experience growing up, were there places in Afghanistan or groups of people in Afghanistan where education for their children and girls was valued? And is that also now completely threatened under the second sort of takeover of the Taliban?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the thing is, Kandahar is one of the most conservative, and it went through, especially in 2001, I mean, it went through like the Taliban time, and it even become, but the thing is, I think Kabul is very different. When I was applying for visa, I went to Kabul, and suddenly I felt like I just thought I was in a different country. First of all, like as soon as the plane landed, like the women took off their burqas, and then when we went outside, like every morning they would just leave the house with their husband to work. So there was this normality of life that, for me, I just didn't feel like it was Afghanistan.
Yeah, there's a scene in the book where I think you were getting a visa, or for some reason you're in Kabul, and Sola goes out to dinner after going to the embassy, and she's only wearing a scarf, and she can feel for the first time the wind on her face or on her body, and that, I think, highlights so clearly the two different lives that people are living in different regions.
Thank you.
I think we have one question here.
public? Okay, so we'll get back to you. Sorry about that. Go ahead. You can go ahead. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if we've given any energy at all to using technology to do an end run around the Taliban pronouncements. A couple of examples. Easy enough to park a drone in the stratosphere over each major city in Afghanistan and broadcast television, radio, shortwave down to the ground. And here in my pocket camera is a chip that can hold 4 hours of televised lessons. So it seems to me there's some major opportunities to bypass these idiots, and I see no energy at all going into that. Is anybody contemplating this stuff?
Go ahead.
I mean, I don't see it at a large scale, but there are some activists, for example, like Pashtana Durrani. She is using some of that, online education. But again, it requires more investment yeah.
Yeah, even beyond that, though, beyond thinking about the kinds of infrastructure we could do, I think for people who do have access to the internet, it's about what content and what languages can we be providing. I know there are some startups in the Bay Area that are working on alternative credentialing programs as well, universities that are partnering. So there's definitely a lot that can be done, even just from a computer or an office space in the US.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sola. Thank you for doing the book. Sola is a Pashto name which means peace. There's a wonderful school also that Sola mentioned to refer to is a boarding school called Sola, bringing girls from Afghanistan to Rwanda to teach them. Stories like Sola is probably not told much, but the struggles are continuously happening in Afghanistan. But we shall also take this book as a reminder also that what war does to societies and nations. 40 years ago, when the Soviet tanks did not tear apart Afghanistan's social fabric, life for all Afghans were different, including those in Kandahar that currently known as to be one of the most conservative, the birthplace for the Taliban. There were universities, women like Sola's mom were going there. There were no veil in most of Afghan society. So that's one consistent reminder, and especially for me as dad to two girls and a human rights commissioner and activist, to see the life of Afghans today go back and roll back to significant level that I published an article yesterday a few days ago, calling it a gender apartheid. 64 decrees and rules being implemented in 2 years that rolls back and eliminates everything that we know about women and its existence in an Afghan society. 19 million people are almost diminished from the face of the society and back to the house. But what makes me optimist and still feel a degree of hope with it is people like Sola and others who are on the street of Kabul and other cities pushing back against those restrictions. So what I would appeal here is to join those voices, promote these kind of work, and join the voices of Afghan women who calls for gender apartheid to be recognized as an international crime. And that's where strong women voices are missing globally. United States have moved on, but I think the civic engagement shall not move on. In the 80s, where everybody joined the apartheid awareness in South Africa and were on the street and civic engagement, raising that voice and shaking morals is probably, again, repeating, but much more quietly, and it demands a lot of engagement, both on social media, but also on the street, to push policymakers to engage. Thank you again, Sola.
Thanks.
By the way, I'm not a senior fellow here.
Thank you so much, Nader. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is JP Falmley. I'm an incoming freshman at Bowdoin College in Maine, and I actually just finished my gap year. During my gap year, I had the opportunity to travel to the US-Mexico border and work with refugees. In addition, here locally, I had the opportunity to work with Catholic charities and tutor Afghan refugee children. And I have heard many success stories and many hopes, and I must say that your story is among the most successful, and I congratulate you for that. And I'm confident that your story will inspire and empower many young women in war-torn countries around the globe, that there is hope of something that we call the American dream. And I wanted to ask you a personal question. How do you feel to be such a successful embodiment of this American dream? And has it changed you as a person? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think I'm still understanding the world, and yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I think in each step there's more thing that you want to achieve, and I think for me there's still a lot to do.
You're very humble, Sola. Very, very humble. Please go ahead, sir.
This is Mirwais Balkhi, fellow here at the Wilson Center. I appreciate for your story and congratulate also for both of you. People like you are exceptional from Afghanistan, especially when we hear the story and what we have witnessed also in Afghanistan. Nowadays, unfortunately, the situation that Sola was experiencing in Kandahar, then back, we are experiencing in Kabul and in all across the country. So what I'll request you is to think about how to translate this book to Persian and Pashto for those millions others who are deprived of going to education and who are struggling in Afghanistan, so that they can get through this book, especially the young generation nowadays in Afghanistan. They are all into social media and they are learning through social media. So that's why they can get this book, even if it's possible to freely distribute for all a new generation, so that they get sentiment and they also go the same path that you are thriving nowadays. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Please.
Hi, my name is John Towers, Envoy Strategy Group and former CNN journalist. I'm curious if there's been any pushback, punishment, persecution of your family since you've left. I mean, your brothers left, you left, you've written a book that sort of explains how to get around some of the Taliban restrictions, so it cannot be, it must be a bit provocative to them. So I wonder if there's been any pushback on your family that's still in Kandahar. Thank you.
Well, we changed, we had to change all identifying details of Sola's family and their locations for that reason, to avoid any pushback against her family. And the name Sola Mahfouz is also a pseudonym to protect her family as well. And I think that was an important choice, a choice that we thought a lot about, but I think it's allowed the story to come out fully and for her to speak freely. And so that was, ultimately an important decision, and also to protect everyone else.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, so I have one last question before I sort of give the floor back to you for any concluding thoughts. Something that you mentioned earlier about basically the patriarchal system that existed, and in reference to your nephew, that he was part of that, and I see how patriarchy and such systems and structures are becoming more difficult for boys and men, creating their own pressures. You have to be the provider. You have to be the breadwinner. You are the protector. And I wonder if there's something there to be said too about the other side of the coin when we are working on the rights of girls and women. What else do we tell the boys and men so that they become champions for equality?
I think in general, it feels like if a woman, they feel threatened. So if women get empowered, when I was growing, there's some time when I was learning, and then I would be challenging someone, like a man relative of mine, and then one would be look to the other. Well, that's what happens when their eyes are open. So
Yeah.
I think. Well, I don't know. I think patriarchy has been with us like for thousands of years. And
Yes,
it's really
unfortunately.
hard. But
Yeah, sometimes it's just about introducing a vocabulary too, right? Like so many of the conversations you've had with family or other people in Afghanistan, it isn't even about trying to make an incredibly complicated, sophisticated argument. It's just about saying to your nephew, like, look, this is what will happen to your sister, and this is what will happen to you, and do you think that's right, that you should have such different futures? And when those conversations aren't even being had and there's no platform for that to happen, then even just pointing out those simple realities can be really powerful.
Thank you for that. Halle, yes.
On a lighter note, whatever happened to Emily? Emily was the person who, via internet, made it possible for Sola to come to the US. So maybe you tell the audience who she was, what she did, and for the few minutes that we
sure. So when I was learning, I listened to English. I was reading English, but I still wanted to practice, especially if I wanted to take the IELTS and all of that. And so, I registered myself in this website called conversationexchange.com, and you put yourself like, okay, I know this language, and I want to learn. For example, like I want to learn English, and I wanted to say, well, I can teach you Pashto or something. And so Emily, she was reading a book about Afghanistan, and it was set in Kandahar, and so she was curious to see what's the language of that country, and she wanted to learn that language. And then that's how we connected, and then I started talking to her, and then she was like, how do you know this thing and everything that we talked about? And then she said, well, you have to come to the US to study. And initially my goal was to go to England, but then she was the one who pointed me to the SAT, and then all along the journey of all of that, she was with me, helping me, and come to the US. So.
Thank you for also sharing about Emily. So we have a few minutes left. I do want to give both of you the floor for any thoughts you want to leave us with, and those also watching online. Sola, you want to start?
Sure. I can start if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I would say, this started out as the story of one girl, but I think it really is the story now of a generation of girls who are being deprived basic, fundamental human rights. And that's something that we all need to pay attention to. We all, need to do whatever is within our power to change. And our really fundamental message is just don't turn away from these stories.
And I think for me, it's again, I think I see it every day. I think like the war strips away humanity, and I think they need to pay attention to more. Yeah, I think when now they see in a story, they have to see like, what does this person have gone through at this point, and also like bring their own experience to this, even though the situation might seem extreme. So to feel it from their own experience.
And that's the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
It helps us all understand each other better and empathize. So thank you so much for your courage and your persistence to tell your story. And thank you, Malaina, for being part of that journey. And we hope for many more conversations and, inshallah, more books. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks.